Hello again, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this Monday show. And up first, hazardous weather graphics. Again, blank. No advisories, watches, or warnings out anywhere for the Panhandle, southern Alaska, from the Gulf to the interior, all the way to the Arctic coast, and especially none out for the Bering Sea. So moving on to satellite imagery, not a lot to see on here. A couple of weak lows there on the southeast, or the lower right-hand side of the chart there. Really not affecting too much. Got a band of moisture across the southeast coast, some variable clouds over the eastern interior, especially over southern Cook Inlet, with a fair amount of sunshine from northern Cook Inlet and the Kenai Peninsula up into the Susitna Valley and across the, looks like the North Gulf Coast, Copper River Basin. But some of that cloudiness over the eastern interior, bringing some areas of light snow to the Fairbanks area today, and dry and partly to mostly sunny over the western interior on out into the Bering Sea. You can see clearing skies extend to just east of the Pribilof Islands, and now clearing out down toward the Alaska Peninsula. Those snow showers really tapering off there, and then a lot of clouds out to the west that is mostly being directed up to the north or held down to the south by strong high pressure over the Bering Sea, extending up into the Chukchi Sea. Had a few light flurries there for the Arctic coast, nothing significant, and then some areas of light snow with variably cloudy to mostly cloudy skies through the central and eastern interior down to about the Alaska Range. Maybe a few isolated snow showers over the Kenai Peninsula, mainly the mountainous terrain there, on up into the Talkeetnas, western Copper River Basin, but again, no significant amounts, and some scattered shower activity with some sunshine over the Panhandle. And winds are still gusting across the Alaska Peninsula, 15 to 30 miles an hour, and up and across Bristol Bay as well, but down from what they had been. Definitely the snow showers a lot less than what they were. System down to the south brought a little bit of moisture up to the central Aleutians today, form of light rain there. And for tonight, that moisture will link up with a stronger system pushing in from the west and spread rain eastward to Atka Island later tonight, and heavier rain and wind will move into the western Aleutians with some 35-knot southeast winds possible there, or pretty likely actually ahead of that front, pushing in toward Chimney and Attu and eventually Kiska Island. Otherwise, high pressure shifts eastward to the southwest coast and up over the eastern north slope, or pretty much just over the north slope, not allowing that front to push eastward a little bit there way out to the west. Otherwise, still a chance of some scattered isolated snow showers, a risk of anyway, for the Alaska Range, the upper Tanana Valley 40-mile country, and possibly even up to the eastern Arctic coast across the eastern Brooks Range area. And that'll extend down into the upslope areas of the eastern Alaska Range there on the north and northeast side, with that northeast wind flow at the surface and a very weak trough. Could see some light snow from Eagle down to Chicken, Northway, Tok, and those areas, maybe even the Besna. But again, whatever falls will be quite light, and could see some scattered rain and snow showers over the northern Panhandle, but the central and southern southeast coast will be mostly dry, with the best chance of clearing the farther south you get toward Dixon Entrance. Otherwise, weak low in the Gulf of Alaska, really not producing any significant weather. It's mostly all to the south. So Kodiak Island, looking at northwest breezes with partly to mostly clear skies and dry conditions. And it'll be mostly sunny for Kodiak Island tomorrow, as well as the Kenai Peninsula, south central Alaska, all of the western interior into the eastern Bering Sea, with light winds, and winds becoming light there for the Alaska Peninsula. And eastern interior, still a chance of some snow shower activity there along the Alaska Range and the mountainous terrain of the eastern interior areas, but should be dry now for the eastern North Slope and Arctic coast. And still a chance of some showers around over the northern Panhandle, but partly to mostly sunny skies again over the southern southeast coast, like was seen today. And that front out west edging eastward a little bit, starting to weaken, but most of the energy getting directed northward there due to the strong high pressure over over the eastern Bering Sea. So all that's flowing right into the Russian Far East where it belongs, and mostly sunny and dry conditions for the eastern Aleutian areas. And for Wednesday, we've got a thing there over the Panhandle that keeps it mostly cloudy and a little unsettled with at least a few showers around, but nothing heavy. Not a bad day. Winds will be light, actually, quite light, and maybe some light snow shower activity pushing into the Wrangell Mountains with some variable cloudiness for the remainder of the Copper River Basin. Otherwise, sunny skies in store for south central Alaska to Kodiak Island, Bristol Bay, maybe even the eastern Aleutians, although there'll probably be some clouds just in advance of that rain shield there pushing in toward Nikolsky, but that's just a chance of any light moisture reaching that area. But periods of rain will continue for the central and western Aleutians, although it becomes more showery behind the front toward Chimney-Attu, but winds won't be a factor at all out there. High pressure shifts back over St. Lawrence Island, controlling the central, northern, and eastern Bering Sea, as well as the interior areas with a lot of sunshine, warmer temperatures. May start seeing some lower 50s showing up in the Susitna Valley and possibly even over the inland areas of the Kenai Peninsula. And for speaking of temperatures, lows tonight in the 30s for the southeast coast, lower 20s, Copper River Basin, Susitna Valley, mid to upper 20s, south center or the Kenai Peninsula and the Matanuska Valley, Turnagain Arm area, and 5 to 10 for the Kuskokwim Valley, 10 for the Bristol Bay. Highs tomorrow. Upper 40s to lower 50s for the southeast coast. Warmer in the southern areas there where there'll be more sunshine, a little cooler in the north with the clouds and still a risk of a shower. Mid 40s in the Copper River Basin and mid to upper 40s for the inland areas of the Kenai Peninsula, including the Matanuska and Susitna Valley. 30 to 35 for the Kuskokwim Valley, lower 40s for Kodiak Island, upper 20s to lower 30s, still a little cool there for Bristol Bay, and lows 15 to 20 for Bristol Bay on Wednesday morning. 10 to 15 there for the Kuskokwim Valley, and lower 20s for the Susitna Valley and portions of the Kenai Peninsula. Otherwise, looking milder for south central Alaska, lower to mid 30s, upper teens for the Copper River Basin, and lows in the 30s again for the southeast coast. Then highs for Wednesday afternoon, even warmer, looking at 53 degrees possibly for Klawock and Craig area, Prince of Wales Island, and upper 40s to lower 50s elsewhere for the Panhandle, mid 40s for the Copper River Basin, and upper 40s to lower 50s for the Susitna Valley. Finally, some 50s showing up. Otherwise, in the 40s, lower 50s for the Kenai Peninsula, mid 40s for Kodiak Island with sunshine, and mid to upper 30s for Bristol Bay and the Kuskokwim Valley. And up to the north, lows 10 to 15 for the central interior, otherwise in the teens off to the east there. Still below zero for most of the Seward Peninsula, as well as the Arctic coast and North Slope. And highs tomorrow, upper 20s to lower 30s for the upper Tanana Valley 40-mile country, otherwise in the 20s, and 0 to 5 for the eastern Arctic coast, but 10 to 15 on the west side. Lows just a shade below zero for the Arctic coast, North Slope into the Brooks Range, Kobuk Valley, and Kotzebue still 4 below, but 4 above for Nome. And for highs, upper 30s to near 40 for the upper Tanana Valley and 40-mile country, and in the 20s for the Seward Peninsula. Lower to mid-20s for the western Arctic coast, 5 to 10 on the east side, and moving down into the Bering Sea. Lows tonight in the lower 20s for the Pribilofs. Otherwise, mid-20s for the Alaska Peninsula, lower 30s for the Fox Islands, and mid to upper 30s for the central and western Aleutians. Highs on Tuesday, near freezing for the Pribilofs, still mid-20s there for St. Lawrence Island, lower 30s in the Alaska Peninsula, 35 to 40 for the Fox Islands, lower 40s for Adak and Atka, and lows up mid to upper 30s for the central and western Aleutians, still in the 20s for the Alaska Peninsula and Pribilofs, and that'll be followed by highs right around the freeze point there for St. Paul and St. George, lower 40s for Adak and Atka, otherwise upper 30s for the Alaska Peninsula, near 40 for Unalaska.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
And moving on to flying weather for Tuesday morning, not too bad over the interior. Still that lingering area of marginal VFR north of the Alaska Range there up to the Yukon River, and maybe some maybe some marginal VFR there north of Prince William Sound and the northern Panhandle. Good VFR though, western interior down to Kodiak Island, Kenai Peninsula. Marginal VFR Bering Sea, central Bering Sea westward to an area of IFR that's extending to the central Aleutians and westward, probably to the Komodorskis. And for the afternoon, still marginal VFR persisting north of the Alaska Range over the eastern interior, and also for the eastern North Gulf Coast and the northern half of the Panhandle. Otherwise, solid VFR, Cook Inlet, Kenai Peninsula, Kodiak, westward to the Pribilofs and northward to the Arctic coast, and some marginal VFR from the Bering Strait across St. Lawrence Island. Then IFR, again, southwest Bering Sea from Shimianatu eastward to Atka Island, and marginal VFR to Unmak Island. And for Wednesday morning, still some marginal VFR for Nikolsky, but then a band of IFR right across Amchitka Island, Adak and Atka. Otherwise, good VFR interior Alaska from the Arctic coast to the Gulf of Alaska. Still some possible marginal VFR there along the eastern Alaska Range, but the Panhandle, good VFR from Dixon Entrance on up and along the North Gulf Coast. And for Wednesday afternoon, now we're seeing an increase in marginal conditions. Kodiak Island up into Kamishak, Kachemak Bay, southern eastern Kenai Peninsula, possibly into Turnagain Arm, and into the southern and southeastern Copper River Basin. All of the North Gulf Coast and the northern half of the Panhandle look marginal at this point. Otherwise, VFR, interior Alaska on up to the Arctic coast, and marginal VFR across the southeastern Bering Sea now to the Alaska Peninsula, and a real narrow band of IFR holding right on top of Adak and Atka. And for the passes, Manitoulin and Adigan, both wide open. VFR, either approach on both passes in the Berks Range tomorrow. And for Lake Clark and Merrill, VFR as well. Rainy starting out marginal, becoming VFR, but windy, marginal VFR at times, marginal at times for Isabel, marginal at times also for Mentasta, and then starting out marginal for Tanita, becoming VFR later in the morning through the afternoon. Portage, VFR, possible lower conditions in the eastern entrance, but nothing too serious. And for Chilkoot and White, marginal VFR. On to the freezing levels. At the surface, pushing a little farther north, up across Cook Inlet, but into the central Copper River Basin and north of the Panhandle, back down across the Alaska Peninsula and just south of the Pribilofs, and then warmer air out over the Aleutians, anywhere from 2,000 to 8,000 feet now, as a little bit warmer air comes northward there. And for the icing possibilities, icing forecast, elevated threat of some possible light icing there over the eastern interior, down into the Copper River Basin, North Gulf Coast, northern Panhandle, but nothing really too serious or significant the way it looks at this point in time. And the jet stream, southeast flow at about 65 knots, or east-southeast 65 knots along the North Gulf Coast, turns southerly, and then back around that high over the Northwest Territories and the Yukon. Otherwise, stronger northerlies, 85 to 95 knots there right across the Bering Strait, St. Lawrence Island, on down across Unalaska Island, and then southerlies out west at about 100 knots across the western Aleutians and western Bering Sea. 3,000-foot winds showing weak low in the eastern Gulf of Alaska there, just south of Yakutat. Very light variable winds over the Panhandle, and a little more of a breeze out of the northeast over the southwest interior, on down to the Alaska Peninsula. Otherwise light for the Berks Range of the Arctic coast and the southeast interior. Southerly winds 55 to 60 knots out over the western Bering Sea, mostly north of Adak Island. And from there, taking a look at turbulence. With those gusty winds, look for moderate turbulence from Chitka Island eastward to near just west of Nikolsky, and also along the Kuskokwim River Valley areas from the Delta, as well as the western Alaska Range down into Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands look pretty turbulent tomorrow, as well as the Aleutian Range and the Alaska Peninsula and southern Kodiak Island. Otherwise, after the break, I'll be back with a look at the marine forecasts.
So that Galena flood back in 2013 was at the intersection of weather and climate. Rick, I often get questions about the difference between weather and climate. How do you distinguish between the two?
Well, that's a really good question, John. One of the analogies that I like to use, the wardrobe analogy. So in my closet, in my dresser, I've got clothes appropriate for 90-degree weather and 50 below weather. That's the climate part of my wardrobe. But what I'm going to put on today, am I going to wear my Hawaiian shirt because it's going to be a hot July day, or am I going to wear my bunny boots because it's going to be 50 below? That's the weather part of my wardrobe.
You know, there's another interesting analogy. I've heard it said that climate is like your personality, whereas weather is like the mood you're in today. It's like that old John Denver song. Some days are diamonds and some days are stones. That's how weather works.
Of course, it's really a continuous range. Just as the Galena ice jam flooding was the result of a weather event, that ice jam, up against that cold spring, a climate event. So too with less impactful events. For instance, a daily record high temperature is a weather event, one day's high. But we put that in a climate context, say comparing to a century or more of individual temperatures on a given date.
So these extreme events like record high temperatures also happen on the seasonal time scale. Just in the last few years, we've had what was called a marine heat wave in the waters south of Alaska, the Gulf of Alaska and the Bering Sea. But the water temperatures in that area set new records in 2015 and 2016.
And most Alaskans are acutely aware that big wildfire seasons are becoming more and more common, most recently in 2015, and the frequency of million-acre seasons has doubled since the early 1990s.
Just this past winter, we had another event in the Bering Sea. The ice extent in the Bering was lower than it had ever been in the last 150 years. That's about as far back as the good records go. There'd never been another year like this one in the Bering with so little sea ice. That had major impacts on the communities along the west coast and the northwest coast.
So, John, what have you been hearing from folks around town about these kind of climate extremes?
I've heard from a number of people who've been here a long time that winters just aren't what they used to be. The average temperatures are higher than they were back in the 1960s and 1970s, and we just don't get the extreme cold days, the days down in the minus 50s or even the minus 60s that we used to experience in Fairbanks back in the, say, the 1960s, 1970s, and even into the 1980s.
Well, and it's not just winter either. 2016 and 2017, the summers brought unusually muggy, humid weather to Fairbanks. We're not used to thinking of that in interior Alaska, but record high humidities during the summer months. As in the winter, we've had a significant increase in freezing rain events, since about 2000. So much so that DOT has changed their road treatment strategy, and now we have the school district building in winter rain days into the calendar. And of course, we all need good weather forecasts for these high impact weather events.
But we know, though, that weather forecasts are sometimes wrong just 3 or 4 days in advance. So if these weather forecasts and the models they're based on can't pick up events like freezing rain 3 or 4 days ahead, how can we believe what they say about climate for the future?
Well, that's a really good question, John. And I think the important thing to remember is that parts of the system are predictable.
So climate models can't give you weather for particular days or even for particular months or years. They actually predict averages. These are averages over periods of a decade or two, or even averages over periods of several years. So they don't give us the month-to-month information that we might want. What are they telling us about the future, though?
Well, these climate models are telling us on the decades-long time frames that warmer winters are going to become more common. We're going to have more frequent, very low sea ice years with late freeze up and early melt out. And the same will be true on Alaskan rivers. We'll have more frequent seasons when freeze up is late and break up is early.
One of the other common threads in these climate model predictions is that heavy rain events and heavy snow events will become more common in the future. That's actually a prediction that the models make for mid-latitudes as well as for high latitudes in areas like Alaska. So we can expect the heavy downpours to become heavier and the heavy winter snows to become heavier than we've been used to. They're also predicting more frequent freezing rain events, getting back to what you talked about earlier. These events that might have happened just once every year or two in the past could actually end up happening several times in a winter in the future, according to the climate models.
And it is important to remember that even in a warming world, there are still going to be seasons and years that are colder than the average, but these cold seasons will become less and less common. So, John, maybe I don't need to have those bunny boots in my closet anymore?
Well, at least you won't need to wear them as often as you did in the past.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Moving on to coastal water forecast. Light winds for all of the panhandle for Tuesday. On the south coast, northeast at 10 knots. For the north coast, east to north at 10 knots. Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, Stevens Passage, and Clarence Strait. All looking at light northerly winds at about 10 knots with seas at 2 feet. And then for the day on Wednesday, for the south coast, there east-southeast winds 15 to 20 knots, and the north coast, east winds 10 to 20 knots, seas 4 to 7 feet there. And for Lynn Canal, north winds 15 knots, seas 3 feet, northeast at 15 with 3-foot seas for Stevens Passage, and Clarence Strait, wind southeast 15 knots. Prince William Sound, small craft advisories for Tuesday, northwest winds 25 knots, 4-foot seas, and north to northeast winds at 25 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast. Western North Gulf Coast, north winds 25 knots, and gale warnings for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands. Northwest winds at 40 knots with seas around 10 feet. Otherwise, Cook Inlet looking at a north wind at 10 to 15 knots. And for Wednesday, Prince William Sound, north winds down to 10 knots now, seas back to 2 feet, and light variable winds at 10 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast, west side there, northeast at 15. And for the Kamishak Bay, northwest winds 20 knots, and the Barren Islands, north winds at 20 knots, and Cook Inlet, northerly winds 10 to 15 knots with 3 to 4 foot seas. Kodiak Island on Tuesday, northwest winds 25 to 30 knots. And for the Alaska Peninsula, north to northwest winds 15 to 20 knots, seas 2 to 4 feet. And for Bristol Bay, north winds 20 knots. And for Wednesday, Bristol Bay, northeast winds 15 knots. And for the Alaska Peninsula, east to northeast winds 15 to 20 knots. Kodiak Island, north to northeast winds 15 to 20 knots with seas down to 3 feet. And for the eastern Aleutians, for Tuesday, east winds 20 to 30 knots, Adak and Atka, east winds 30 knots. And for the western Aleutians, southeast winds 30 to 35 knots, with seas running 13 to 16 feet out that way. For Wednesday, for the area from Kiska to Shemya, winds will be south to southeast at 20 knots. And for the central Aleutians, east winds 30 to 35 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, east to northeast winds 25 to 30 knots with 5 to 11 foot seas. For the southwest coast on Tuesday, north winds 15 to 25 knots, strongest south of Nunivak Island. Pribilofs, east winds 20 knots. St. Matthew Island, east winds 15 knots. And St. Lawrence Island, light north breeze at 10 knots. Norton Sound, north at 15. And then for the day on Wednesday, Norton Sound, Yukon Delta Coast, and St. Lawrence Island, all looking at a north wind at about 20 knots. East winds 30 knots for St. Matthew Island, northeast 20 for the Pribilofs, and north 15 for the Kuskokwim Delta Coast. For the eastern Beaufort Sea, variable winds at 10 knots and south winds 15 knots for the central and western Arctic coast. The Chukchi Sea looking at south winds 10 to 20 knots. And then for the day on Wednesday, light variable winds 5 to 10 knots from Wales to Cape Thompson. Otherwise, the western Arctic coast looking at south winds 10 to 20 knots, and for the central coast, south winds at 10 knots, and for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, variable winds 5 to 10 knots. For tonight, high pressure keeps winds light up over the north slope and the western interior into the eastern Bering Sea. Look for wind and rain to advance eastward from the western Aleutians as far east as Atka by late tonight. Otherwise, chance of some shower activity over the northern panhandle and some scattered snow showers along the Alaska Range and maybe over the eastern interior areas. But tomorrow stays mostly sunny for the southern panhandle and some scattered rain and snow showers in the north areas. Still a risk of a snow shower along the Alaska Range and in the Tanana Valley to the Yukon Flats area, but nothing significant. Sunny skies elsewhere around interior Alaska that will extend into the central Bering Sea. With light wind, stays breezy with periods of rain for the central Aleutians out to Shemya, and that's about it for the precipitation on Tuesday. Not much different on Wednesday. Looks like rain tries to push into Nikolsky out there on Unmak Island, but doesn't quite make it. Cook Inlet, though, and much of interior Alaska will be mostly sunny with light winds, isolated showers for the panhandle.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.